chronic alcoholic. When you get married, there's the stuff when you need to care about me. And when you have a kids, you will need to care about your kids too, not just about you.
When Jovi and Yara first connected, it all seemed like a fairy tale waiting to happen. A guy from Louisiana, globe-trotting for work, meets a young woman from Ukraine on a travel app. Sparks fly, messages turn into calls, and suddenly, distance feels like nothing. You know that excitement where every text makes your heart race? That was them, living on adrenaline and anticipation. But long-distance romance has a sneaky side. It's a little bubble where the hard stuff doesn't exist yet, and reality is postponed. That energy can feel magical, but it's also misleading. Jovi was the life of every party, a man used to adventure and freedom. Yara, elegant and methodical, had a sense of order she wasn't willing to compromise. At first, differences felt charming. He'd joke, she'd laugh. But charm can hide friction, and early on, their lifestyle gaps started whispering warnings. Yara craved stability, consistency, and connection, while Jovi thrived on unpredictability and his offshore adventures. You could almost see the seeds of tension planting themselves quietly between calls and emojis. Then came the realities of visas, flights, and the ticking clock of love under a K-1 visa. Yara's decision to leave everything behind and move to the U.S. wasn't just romantic, it was huge. She was stepping into a life that was entirely foreign, literally and figuratively, with no safety net. Jovi, caught in his high-demand offshore career, didn't fully grasp the weight of that move yet. His work was a world apart: deep sea rigs, long stretches at sea, adrenaline and skill. It was impressive, sure, but it also meant absence. Lots of it. And that absence started its quiet work on the marriage even before the wedding. And then, just when things were starting to feel like a manageable adjustment, Yara discovered she was pregnant. That changed everything. Suddenly, the stakes were higher than cute weekend visits or travel surprises. A baby doesn't wait for schedules or flight rotations. Her world shifted overnight, and what might have been manageable stress now became a test of endurance and patience. Yara wasn't just navigating a new country. She was navigating a growing responsibility she had no backup for, while Jovi's career remained non-negotiable in his mind. By the time she landed in the U.S., all the differences that seemed small at first had amplified. The excitement of reunion was tempered by exhaustion, isolation, and the looming reality that her partner's love and her needs might not align in the practical ways she desperately needed. Yara was stepping into a new life, pregnant, alone, and already sensing that Jovi's offshore job would dominate the rhythm of their early marriage. She had taken the leap for love, but the landing was rougher than she imagined, and both were about to learn that chemistry alone doesn't pay bills, change diapers, or fill emotional gaps. From the moment Yara arrived in the United States, reality hit harder than she could have imagined. Pregnancy was already taking its toll: severe nausea, constant exhaustion, and the relentless worry that something could go wrong with her and the baby. She wasn't just adapting to a new city or learning a new culture. She was fighting through a body that refused to cooperate and a mind that never stopped racing. Every errand, every doctor visit, every new street she had to navigate alone piled onto the pressure she felt. Meanwhile, Jovi's world barely changed. To him, leaving for work offshore was just part of the routine, a job he had done for years without questioning. Weeks away at a time, living on rigs and ships, controlling underwater robots in dangerous conditions, and earning a high salary, that was normal life. But for Yara, it was another form of absence that made her feel like she had been left to fend for herself in a life that was supposed to be shared. Even small tasks became mountains. Grocery shopping felt exhausting. Handling paperwork for a new apartment was overwhelming. Doctor appointments became lonely battles. The simple act of cooking a meal while sick from hyperemesis gravidarum felt heroic and isolating. Each night she went to bed without Jovi there, the emptiness felt sharper. The distance wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The messages and video calls couldn't replace the presence she craved, the moments she needed him for. She wasn't asking for perfection, just consistency, a partner who could shoulder some of the weight with her. But instead, she was learning a harsh lesson. Intent doesn't always equal impact. Jovi believed he was doing the right thing by working hard for their future. But what she felt was abandonment, loneliness, and fear. When Mila arrived 7 months later, the stakes became impossible to ignore. The birth should have been a joyous celebration, but it landed in the middle of a pandemic, and Jovi's work schedule meant he was frequently absent. Yara found herself functioning as a married single mother. Every feeding, every diaper change, every sleepless night fell squarely on her shoulders. She learned to navigate the hospital discharge forms alone, to decipher the confusing American medical system, and to care for a newborn in a home that was still foreign to her. Her heart ached for the partner she had chosen to share this life with. But in practice, she was handling it alone. Love existed, but it didn't fill the gaps created by absence. Jovi's returns were complicated. When he finally came home, exhausted from offshore rotations, he wanted to relax, to catch up on lost sleep, maybe party, maybe unwind with friends. But Yara's world had been running in overdrive without him. The rhythm of daily life, the constant vigilance required to manage both a new country and a newborn, left her drained and anxious. His presence, when it came in short bursts, wasn't restorative. It sometimes reminded her of all the time he hadn't been there. Arguments flared over small things, the kind of fights where words cut deeper because the wounds had been building silently for weeks. The tension wasn't about money or lack of love or even specific decisions. It was about a pattern of absence that had become unbearable. Her feelings of isolation deepened because trust and consistency were in short supply. Every promise of more time together or attention was fragile, slipping away as soon as he had to leave again. She started holding her breath, keeping her expectations low, and compartmentalizing emotions so she could survive each separation. It wasn't dramatic or explosive at first, but the quiet accumulation of disappointment and resentment became a heavy undercurrent in the marriage. That kind of tension isn't easy to spot from the outside, but for Yara, it shaped every interaction. It made her cautious with joy, protective of Mila, and skeptical of assurances. Her love for Jovi was still there, but it was tempered with a wariness born of repeated absence. The psychology of this era is subtle, but sharp. Jovi's efforts to provide financial stability didn't cancel out the emotional void. Money can buy comfort, but it can't replace presence. Intentions matter, but their impact matters more. Yara was experiencing that lesson firsthand. Each absence weighed on her, and each return, while welcome, carried the reminder of what she had endured alone. She began to crave ordinary things, morning routines, bedtime stories, casual conversations, simple moments of connection that had been impossible to achieve consistently. That craving, coupled with Jovi's continued prioritization of offshore work, created a tension that no amount of love or good intentions could smooth over. Even when friends, family, or the cameras captured happy moments, the underlying strain was palpable. Smiles and shared jokes existed alongside frustration and exhaustion, creating a push and pull that left both partners on edge. Yara learned to navigate the complicated emotional landscape of loving someone who was physically present only part of the time, while Jovi remained largely unaware of how critical his daily presence had become. This imbalance, unnoticed by many, shaped the next chapter of their story, setting the stage for choices that would challenge both of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. By the time the cameras caught up with them again, it was clear the pattern wasn't changing. Seasons passed, but the arguments felt like reruns, each one slightly more strained than the last. Jovi left for work, Yara stayed behind, and the same tension played out in slightly different settings. The moves, the trips, the therapy sessions, they all seemed promising at first, like they could reset the balance, but the underlying rhythm of absence was relentless. It wasn't dramatic in a single instant, it was erosion, slow and steady, wearing down patience and trust until every interaction carried a trace of fatigue and frustration. The move to Miami was supposed to feel like a fresh start, a new city, new opportunities, and a chance for Yara to feel supported, surrounded by a Ukrainian community and a network of friends. It should have been energizing, almost liberating. And in some ways, it was. Yara finally had people she could lean on, advice she could trust, and reminders that she didn't have to handle everything alone. But Miami didn't solve the bigger problem. Jovi's work ethic, his need for identity outside the family, and the offshore schedule were still the same. The environment around her changed, but the core dynamic, the pattern of his absence and her burden, remained stubbornly intact. Therapy sessions were intense, sometimes awkward, often revealing more than either expected. Birth control became a source of conflict, not because of deceit in itself, but because it exposed deep misalignment in priorities and trust. Yara's choice to protect herself and her autonomy collided with Jovi's assumptions about partnership and planning. Emotional distance had seeped into intimacy. Moments that should have been about connection often felt transactional or perfunctory. Jovi's mind and identity were tied to offshore work, and he clung to it as though stepping back would diminish him. In practice, it diminished the marriage more than it preserved him. There were moments when Jovi's pride and sacrifice were undeniable. His work was dangerous, demanding, and highly skilled. He had spent nearly 2 decades building a career few could claim, and that came with perks, money, and a sense of accomplishment. Fans could see that, and even Yara acknowledged it at times. But the question lingered, at what cost? The high salary and impressive Ursum didn't fill the emotional gaps. They didn't soothe sleepless nights, hold a baby, or make someone feel consistently valued. You could respect his career while still recognizing that it had become a barrier to real partnership. Every return from offshore was a mix of relief and tension. Yara welcomed him home, but the interactions were charged with unspoken resentment. Conversations about schedules, priorities, and expectations repeatedly ended with compromises that satisfied neither fully. Arguments didn't always explode because the anger was buried under layers of resignation and exhaustion. They tiptoed around explosive moments, but the undercurrent never dissipated. Fans watching could see flashes of love, flashes of hope, but also glimpses of something quietly breaking apart. The repeat cycles highlighted a frustrating truth. Intentions don't automatically lead to understanding or presence. Jovi thought he was giving stability through income, adventure, and provision. Yara's reality was completely different. She wanted tangible support, shared responsibility, and emotional connection. Money was irrelevant without consistency and reliability. Love was not enough if it arrived in fragments. The irony was brutal. The very thing that gave Jovi confidence and identity was the thing that kept the marriage in tension, like a pendulum swinging back and forth between affection and frustration. Miami gave Yara support and independence, yes, but it didn't heal the marriage. She had friends, community, and professional outlets, yet the absence of her husband's emotional investment persisted. She could manage the city and the baby, but managing the relationship remained a challenge. This was the calm before the storm, a deceptive pause where fans and the couple themselves might have imagined a solution was imminent. The cracks were not visible in a single scene, they were cumulative, predictable, and waiting for a catalyst big enough to force a reckoning. Fans watching these seasons often debated who was right or wrong. Some sided with Jovi, praising his sacrifice, the difficulty of his job, and his dedication to providing materially. Others sympathized with Yara, understanding the isolation, the unrelenting pressure, and the quiet erosion of emotional trust. Both perspectives held truth, but the narrative momentum pointed toward one unavoidable reality: a breaking point was coming. The marriage's survival depended not on money, intention, or proximity alone, but on the courage to reset priorities in a way neither partner had fully mastered yet. The story at this stage balanced on delicate tension. The audience could see potential relief through the move, the therapy, and the couple's efforts. Yet every new interaction reminded viewers that the underlying issues were unresolved. Jovi's identity tied to offshore work, Yara's need for presence and trust, and the silent accumulation of resentment created a pressure cooker environment. The calm felt like peace, but in truth, it was the quiet before the choices that would finally determine the trajectory of their marriage. December 29 hit like a bomb no one saw coming. Jovi posted a simple photo on Instagram, something that looked harmless at first glance. But the caption made hearts stop. First day in the last 17 years without a job. Cheers to new beginnings. That was it. No explanations, no assurances, just a statement that flipped the entire narrative fans had been following for years. 17 years of offshore work, of identity built around presence at sea, gone in a single sentence. People scrolled, stared, and reloaded their feeds, unsure if they had read it right. Shock rippled through the fan base. Praise poured in from those who had been waiting for him to put family first, while others panicked, worried about bills, stability, and the unknown future. For Yara, the moment was complicated. Relief was immediate and undeniable. After years of arguing, begging, relocating, and shouldering responsibilities alone, the man she married was finally choosing presence over routine, love over identity tied to work. But alongside that relief was anxiety, sharp and persistent. How would they manage financially? Could Jovi truly leave behind the job that defined his self-worth without resentment? And what would it mean for their relationship if the structure that had unknowingly held them in tension suddenly disappeared? The shock wasn't in the announcement itself, but in the magnitude of its implications. To outsiders, losing a high-paying offshore job sounds catastrophic. But for Yara, the job had been the real problem all along. Every rotation offshore had been a small abandonment, every absence a wedge between them, every paycheck a reminder that money doesn't replace presence. Now, the identity that had once symbolized success, pride, and masculinity was gone. Jovi faced the collapse of a persona he had built for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't unemployment in the usual sense. It was a complete disruption of the life structure he had relied on. Presence, which Yara had craved and lacked, suddenly became the primary currency in their relationship. Fans immediately began speculating. Some asked if the couple would struggle with daily routines. Others debated whether Jovi's choice was impulsive or long overdue. Every comment, every theory seemed to magnify the stakes. This wasn't just about a couple. It was a story about identity, marriage, and what it really means to provide. For viewers, the post raised questions far beyond reality TV drama. Was Jovi brave, foolish, or both? Was this a redemption, or the calm before an even bigger storm? The emotional tension was fast and contradictory. The world saw a man stepping away from financial security, a career, and a lifestyle most would kill for. Yara saw freedom, presence, and finally the possibility of partnership. Yet she also saw vulnerability, instability, and a shift in pressure she hadn't anticipated. Their dynamic had been anchored by his absence. Removing that anchor left everything unsteady. Daily routines, parenting, decisions about finances, and even small habits suddenly required renegotiation. For the first time, Yara and Jovi had to confront the reality of sharing life fully, without the escape valve of a demanding offshore job. It's easy to oversimplify the moment as liberation, But that misses the nuance. The very thing that had caused isolation, resentment, and subtle erosion of intimacy was gone. But in its absence, the couple faced something harder: genuine connection without distraction. Presence can feel like risk when you're used to avoidance. Jovi had spent years proving himself in a world of tangible results, rigs, schedules, paychecks. Now, the rewards weren't measurable, the challenges were constant, and the consequences were personal. He could no longer escape through work. Every morning, every missed bedtime, every mundane decision became a reflection of his priorities. Yara's relief carried layers of fear. She had learned to be independent, resilient, and self-sufficient. The support network in Miami helped, but the expectation of Jovi's full-time presence was untested. Could he rise to the occasion? Or would old habits resurface in subtler ways? Would arguments reemerge now that avoidance wasn't an option? The anxiety was not about money or logistics. It was about trust, reliability, and whether the emotional gap that had grown over years could be truly bridged. For viewers, the post reframed the entire narrative. A job that once seemed heroic, admirable, and essential became the antagonist in a relationship story. Absence, not unemployment, had been the threat all along. Love and intention alone hadn't been enough. Presence, something rarely dramatic or cinematic, became the real turning point. The moment asked the audience to reconsider everything they had assumed about success, marriage, and what it means to truly provide. Questions multiplied in the minds of fans. What will replace Jovi's professional identity? How will the couple redistribute responsibility and navigate routines together? Can the emotional connection hold under the weight of a life fully shared rather than fragmented by absence? And what happens when the fallback of work disappears completely, leaving only the reality of the marriage to sustain them? Each answer was unknown, each possibility fraught with tension and promise. The Instagram post marked more than just a career change. It was the first real pivot in the marriage's trajectory. Everything that had been simmering, the isolation, the frustration, the silent accumulation of resentment, was suddenly exposed to scrutiny and necessity. Jovi's absence had once defined the rhythm of the household. Now, the rhythm would have to be built together. And that kind of rebuilding is unpredictable, challenging, and deeply human. By the end of the day, fans were left with more questions than answers. Praise, criticism, hope, and fear collided in the comment section. Yara and Jovi themselves had to navigate a new reality, one where presence was no longer optional and old patterns could no longer hide behind work. The announcement was simple, but its implications were enormous. Unemployment became a turning point, a test of endurance, trust, and emotional alignment. It was clear that life would never look the same. And the marriage, for better or worse, would be defined by what came next. The moment Jovi stepped away from his offshore career, the marriage entered a new phase, one where presence became the real measure of commitment. For years, Yara had carried the weight of daily life, largely on her own. From waking up to feed Mila, navigating school preparations, doctor visits, groceries, and household chores, she had been running a one-woman operation disguised as a marriage. Jovi's returns, brief and irregular, felt like fleeting respites rather than true partnership. Now, with work no longer dictating his schedule, the routines that once highlighted absence became opportunities for connection. Every morning breakfast, bedtime story, and casual conversation was a chance for him to show up fully. And the contrast was stark. Tasks that had been Yara's solo responsibility suddenly required collaboration, presence, and attention. The shift was more challenging than any offshore rotation could have been. On a rig, Jovi had clear objectives, measurable results, and a structured environment. The rewards were tangible: money, recognition, adventure. At home, there were no clear milestones. Success was subtle and relational. Noticing Mila's mood, listening to Yara without distraction, stepping in to share responsibilities without being asked. Presence demanded patience, humility, and consistency. Every day offered a new test of emotional endurance. In some ways, it was harder than the job that had previously defined him, because failure wasn't external or technical, it was personal, relational, and felt immediately in the fabric of daily life. Yara's role in this transformation was just as critical. She didn't need rescue. Over the years, she had built her independence, established a community, and gained confidence managing her business, friendships, and motherhood. The move to Miami had been strategic, not just emotional. It gave her support and perspective, preparing her for a partner who could finally show up consistently. Her strength wasn't diminished by the shift. In fact, it became the anchor for the relationship. She was finally able to relax enough to allow Jovi to engage fully, without sacrificing her autonomy or sense of security. For Jovi, showing up without a uniform, without offshore demands, without the identity he had built around danger, expertise, and high pay, required a kind of vulnerability he hadn't practiced in nearly 2 decades. The new work, being present in mundane, everyday ways, was invisible in the eyes of the world, but monumental in impact. Folding laundry, helping with homework, cooking dinner, responding to Yara's subtle emotional cues, these actions slowly rebuilt trust and intimacy. It was a quiet revolution, a redefinition of what it meant to provide for the people you love. This period also illuminated an important truth. Money supports life, but presence builds it. For years, financial stability had masked the absence, allowing the relationship to continue despite emotional gaps. But the marriage itself required more than income. It needed attention, consistency, and participation. Every act of presence, listening, helping, prioritizing time together, became a building block for the kind of partnership Yara had been seeking from the start. At the same time, the shift exposed the subtleties of sacrifice. Jovi's previous sacrifices, time away, hard work, risking safety offshore, had been meaningful in isolation. But without connection, they also created resentment. Yara had felt abandoned despite the impressive salary, and the absence had silently eroded intimacy. Sacrifice without relational engagement breeds tension. Now, his sacrifices were tied to being present, and that combination of effort and attention began to reshape the household dynamic. For viewers, it was a lesson in emotional labor. Much of what Yara had managed behind the scenes, household logistics, emotional well-being, health concerns, parenting, was now visible to Jovi, making him realize the magnitude of what he had been missing. Presence illuminated what absence had hidden, forcing both to adjust expectations and priorities. The change wasn't instantaneous, but it was profound. Growth required discomfort on both sides. Yara had to let go of complete control and trust that Jovi would engage consistently. Jovi had to leave behind a professional identity that had defined him for decades, accepting that mastery in daily life was less visible but equally demanding. Both had to confront old patterns, communicate openly, and tolerate mistakes without retreating to defense or avoidance. It was a learning curve that involved friction, trial, and reflection, but it offered a path toward realignment. The emotional stakes remained high. Every new routine was a test. Would Jovi respond when Yara needed help without prompting? Would he recognize small emotional cues instead of relying on grand gestures? Could he sustain presence when no one was watching? When rewards weren't immediate or tangible? These were the subtle pressures that determined whether this transformation could endure. For Yara, cautious hope emerged from observation rather than expectation. She saw him trying, learning, and adjusting. The relief that had accompanied his resignation from offshore work was now mingled with optimism, tempered by the memory of past cycles. She had independence, community, and experience. but she also had a clear vision of what presence truly looked like. Her standards weren't negotiable, but they were fair. This balance created the possibility of alignment, even if it required patience and vigilance. Jovi, on the other hand, faced the challenge of rebuilding identity without the escape of offshore work. Success was no longer measured by accomplishments at sea or paychecks deposited. It was measured by the health of his relationships and the cohesion of daily life at home. That kind of transformation is slow, demanding, and deeply personal. It involves redefining self-worth in a context where validation comes from connection rather than achievement. By the end of this period, the couple's trajectory had shifted. The narrative that absence was acceptable had been replaced with one where engagement mattered most. Every shared routine, every act of emotional labor, and every moment of attention became a reinforcement of the marriage's foundation. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, and it wasn't guaranteed to last. But for the first time, the conditions for sustained partnership were present. The cautious hope at this stage is powerful because it is earned. Both Yara and Jovi are actively negotiating a life built on presence, accountability, and collaboration. They are learning that love alone isn't sufficient without follow-through and attention, and that growth requires discomfort, effort, and humility. For viewers, the story delivers a clear lesson. Relationships thrive on consistency, emotional labor, and visibility of effort, not just intention or financial provision. The question that lingers is unavoidable. Can this alignment survive the grind of routine? Can Jovi rebuild identity without the escape hatch of offshore work? Will the habits of presence stick, or will old patterns quietly reassert themselves? For now, the answer remains uncertain. But in these early days of full engagement, there is a glimpse of what a marriage can become when love is paired with consistent, daily presence. Yara has her partner more fully in her life than ever before, and Jovi has the opportunity to define himself through shared responsibility and connection, rather than titles and paychecks. The stage is set, the lessons are visible, and the narrative has shifted. What comes next will test both of them in ways the cameras can capture, and the audience can only watch, waiting to see whether presence will ultimately prove stronger than absence, and whether cautious hope will become lasting reality. Fans exploded online the moment Jovi's Instagram post went public. Some were cheering like he'd won the lottery of marital redemption, praising him for finally putting family first. Comments celebrated the choice, applauding the shift from absence to presence, from paycheck to participation. People saw a husband and father finally prioritizing what had been missing all along. Relief, hope, and a sense of justice for Yara bubbled through threads and feeds. But not everyone was convinced. Some fans worried about finances, about the pressure of full-time presence, and whether Jovi could sustain this change long-term. They questioned whether identity built over 17 years could pivot without cracks, and whether a routine that had never been tested under normal, everyday life could really hold. The concern wasn't cynicism. It was realism. Presence sounds simple, but it carries its own weight, responsibilities, and challenges that offshore work had masked. Both fan perspectives hold truth. One side celebrates emotional availability finally being prioritized. The other fears the fragility of untested consistency. What's important here is that this isn't a fairy tale ending. The story doesn't say the marriage is fixed or that problems evaporated the moment Jovi stepped off the rig. The work has only begun. Presence is a choice, and making it a habit takes repetition, patience, and accountability. Alignment has started, yes, but the real test will come when routines become mundane, when stress spikes, when life interrupts intention. The stakes are high, precisely because absence had been normalized for so long. Every morning, bedtime, chore, or emotional moment is a chance to reinforce or erode what they've started building. The emotional payoff, though, is undeniable. The worst nightmare that fans and even Yara feared, the possibility of financial instability, the anxiety of an unknown path, has been reframed. It turns out, the real danger had never been money or career. It was distance, absence, and invisibility. By stepping away from offshore work, Jovi created the rare space where partnership could actually happen in real time. Shared routines, emotional labor, and presence are no longer abstract expectations. They are daily practices. The marriage is no longer a concept measured in text messages and brief visits. It is alive, tangible, and unfolding in front of viewers and fans alike. And now the real question lingers, the one that will keep audiences coming back. Will this presence survive the pressure of routine? Can Jovi maintain consistency when novelty fades and stress creeps in? Will the lessons of absence continue to influence both of them? Or will old habits quietly reassert themselves? In the next video, we'll explore exactly that, watching whether the foundations they've started building can hold under the weight of reality, and whether presence can truly become the default, not just an aspiration. This is the chapter where hope meets practice, where relief collides with challenge, and where the couple finally has a chance to show that love paired with presence can outlast the patterns of the past. The story isn't over, but the narrative has shifted. For the first time, marriage is happening in real time, and the audience is left eagerly waiting to see what comes next.